History often turns not on brute force alone, but on surprise, adaptation, and the enemy's failure to recognize what is standing right in front of them. During World War II, the German army fielded one of the most feared armored vehicles ever built, the Panther tank. With its thick armor, powerful long-barreled gun, and excellent range, the Panther dominated many battlefields. Yet even this machine had a weakness. It was not simply outgunned, it was outthought. The Germans failed to recognize a secret tank hiding in plain sight until the moment it destroyed their prized Panther. Imagine a battlefield where nothing seems hidden. Steel is loud, engines roar, guns flash, and smoke rises like a signal flare to everyone watching. And yet, in the middle of all that noise and violence, something decisive can still remain unseen, not because it is invisible, but because it is too familiar to notice. That was the real secret behind the tank that German crews failed to recognize until it had already destroyed one of their most feared machines, the Panther. The secret was not stealth, not camouflage, not some futuristic trick of concealment. The secret was familiarity and the deadly power of assumptions. By the later years of the Second World War, German tank crews believed they understood their enemy. They had studied silhouettes, memorized profiles, trained themselves to identify Allied armor at a glance. The squat outline of the American Sherman was burned into their minds. It was everywhere. It was the most common Allied tank on the Western Front, so common that it became almost part of the background of war itself. German crews saw Shermans the way one stops noticing streetlights on the way home, always present, rarely alarming. They believed they knew exactly what a Sherman could and could not do. They believed, above all, that it could not seriously threaten a Panther from the front at normal combat ranges. That belief, repeated often enough, hardened into certainty, and certainty in war can be fatal. The Panther was a masterpiece of German engineering on paper. Thick sloped armor, a powerful high-velocity gun, and excellent optics gave its crews confidence bordering on arrogance. From hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 meters away, a Panther could destroy most Allied tanks before they could even reply effectively. German doctrine reinforced this confidence. Panthers were trained to fight at range, to use their superior guns and optics to dominate open ground. The enemy, they believed, would be seen first, engaged first, and destroyed first. And when that enemy appeared to be a Sherman, the sense of control only increased. This is where familiarity began to work against the Germans. The Sherman had become a known quantity in their minds, lightly armored, undergunned, dangerous in numbers, but not in individual duels. German tankers learned to prioritize threats. A Sherman was not a tiger. It was not a Panther. It was something you dealt with efficiently, methodically, without panic. So when German gunners scanned the battlefield and saw the familiar boxy shape of a Sherman, their brains filled in the rest of the story automatically. They thought they knew how that encounter would end. What they did not immediately recognize was that not all Shermans were the same. Externally, the tank that would shatter this assumption looked almost identical to the dozens of others rumbling across Normandy. Same hull, same turret shape, same tracks chewing through mud and hedgerows. To a hurried glance through a gun sight, especially under stress, it was just another Sherman. And that was precisely the point. This tank was not trying to hide, it was hiding in plain sight. The British had learned painful lessons early in the war about German armor superiority. They knew that facing Panthers and Tigers with standard Shermans was a costly business. Instead of waiting for an entirely new tank design, they chose a different solution. Take what the enemy already thinks he understands and quietly change what matters most. They fitted a powerful 17 6-pounder anti-tank gun into the familiar Sherman chassis. It was an awkward, difficult modification. The gun was long and powerful, the ammunition bulky, the interior cramped. But when it fired, it could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at ranges that shocked German crews. This was the Sherman Firefly, though German tankers would not learn that name until much later. On the battlefield, the Firefly did not announce itself. It did not glow differently, it did not move differently, it did not roar louder. Its strength lay in deception born from normality. German crews saw it and assumed it was harmless at long range. They exposed themselves, they delayed. They focused on other targets, and in those seconds sometimes just a heartbeat too long. The familiar shape revealed its unfamiliar bite. When a Panther was destroyed by what appeared to be an ordinary Sherman, confusion spread faster than fear. German tank doctrine relied heavily on recognition and expectation. The battlefield was already chaotic, but certainty about enemy capabilities provided mental order. Once that certainty cracked, everything became unstable. Crews began to question what they were seeing. Was that really just a Sherman? How many of them could kill at this distance? Which one should we engage first? This is where familiarity became a weapon more powerful than camouflage. Camouflage hides you from the eye. Familiarity hides danger from the mind. The German gunner might see the tank clearly, perfectly framed in his sight, and still underestimate it. He might choose to adjust aim carefully instead of firing immediately. He might wait for a better shot, confident that he had time. And that delay could be the difference between firing and dying. The Firefly exploited this psychological gap mercilessly. British crews understood their role well. They often positioned Fireflies slightly behind or among standard Shermans, letting the more common tanks draw attention. German gunners would engage the obvious threat, only to be struck moments later by a round they never expected to face. The battlefield is not just metal and explosions, it is perception, judgment, and belief. The Firefly attacked all three. The destruction of a Panther by what appeared to be a normal Sherman had an outsized impact. Panthers were symbols of German armored dominance. They represented technical superiority, the idea that German engineering could overcome Allied numbers. Losing one was bad enough. Losing one to a tank you believed inferior was deeply unsettling. It suggested that the enemy was learning faster than expected, adapting faster than doctrine allowed. It suggested that knowledge itself had become unreliable. Over time, German crews did adapt. They learned to look for the longer gun barrel, to prioritize Fireflies when they could identify them. But even that adaptation carried a cost. Now every Sherman had to be treated as a potential Firefly. Every familiar shape became suspicious. The mental shortcut that once saved time and effort was gone. The battlefield became heavier, slower, more stressful. Decision-making suffered, and hesitation crept in where confidence once lived. This is the deeper lesson hidden inside the story. The decisive advantage was not just the gun, though the gun mattered. It was not just tactics, though tactics mattered. It was the deliberate exploitation of human expectation. War is fought by people, not machines, and people rely on patterns to survive chaos. When those patterns are turned against them, even superior equipment can fail. The Germans were not blind. They saw the tank clearly. They misjudged it, and that misjudgment flowed directly from experience, training, and repetition. Familiarity had trained them too well. They had learned what a Sherman was, and that knowledge became a liability when the Sherman changed without changing its appearance. In a broader sense, this moment reflects a recurring truth in history. Innovation does not always arrive with a dramatic new shape or a revolutionary design. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing the face of something old. Those who rely too heavily on past knowledge may fail to notice that the rules have shifted beneath their feet. The Germans believed they had categorized the Sherman. Once categorized, it stopped demanding attention. That is when it became most dangerous. The battlefield encounter between a Panther and a Firefly is not just a technical story about armor penetration and gun calibers. It is a story about perception, about how quickly the mind fills in gaps, about how assumptions can survive even when reality has already changed. The German crews did not fail because they lacked courage or skill. They failed because they trusted what they thought they knew. And that is why the secret was not invisibility. The tank did not vanish from sight. It stood there in full view, unmistakable in outline and motion. The secret was familiarity, the quiet confidence that says, "I've seen this before," and the fatal delay that follows. By the time the Panther crew realized that this Sherman was not what it seemed, the lesson was already written in smoke, fire, and twisted steel. In the end, the story reminds us that the most dangerous threats are not always the ones that look new or frightening. Sometimes they are the ones that look ordinary, the ones we stop questioning. On that battlefield, the familiar shape of a Sherman carried a new truth inside it, and the Panther that failed to recognize this truth paid the ultimate price. When people speak about secret weapons in war, they often imagine something exotic: strange silhouettes, revolutionary engines, invisible armor, or machines so advanced they appear almost supernatural. Yet history repeatedly shows that the most decisive advantages are often far less glamorous. They are hidden in plain sight, embedded not in the overall appearance of a weapon, but in one critical component that changes the balance of power. In this case, the real secret was not the tank itself, not its shape, its speed, or its reputation, but the gun it carried and the philosophy behind how that gun was used. By the middle of the Second World War, the German Panther tank was widely feared. It was fast for its size, well-armored, and equipped with a high-velocity gun capable of destroying most Allied tanks at long range. German crews trusted it, Allied crews respected it, and battlefield narratives often revolved around it as a symbol of German armored superiority. So when German tank units encountered what appeared to be a familiar Allied tank, something they believed they understood, something they believed they could defeat, they felt confidence, even complacency. That confidence was their mistake, because the battlefield reality had changed, and the change was not in the tank's outline, but in the power and purpose of the weapon mounted on it. The gun altered everything. It changed engagement distances, penetration capabilities, crew behavior, and tactical decisions. A tank is not merely armor on tracks. It is a delivery system for force. The gun is the point where design meets destruction. When that point shifts, the entire system shifts with it. German crews were trained to assess threats visually, identify the tank, recall its known strengths and weaknesses, and respond accordingly. This method had worked well earlier in the war, but it relied on one critical assumption: that the enemy's capabilities remained static. The moment that assumption became false, recognition became a liability rather than an advantage. The gun represented an evolution in intent. It was not simply larger or louder. It embodied a different answer to the battlefield problem. Earlier, Allied tanks were often designed with versatility in mind: infantry support, mobility, mechanical reliability, and ease of production. Anti-tank combat was important, but not always the primary role. As German armor grew heavier and more lethal, this balance shifted. The gun mounted on the newer tank was designed specifically to kill German armor at ranges previously considered safe. It was built to challenge the Panther on its own terms and, crucially, to defeat it. This shift caught German crews off guard because it violated their expectations. They believed they were facing a known opponent, one they had studied, fought, and beaten before. They expected shells to bounce, armor to hold, and the engagement to unfold in a familiar pattern. Instead, they were met with penetrating fire that struck harder and farther than anticipated. The shock was not merely physical, it was psychological. When a tank you believe inferior destroys one of your best machines, the certainty that underpins battlefield decision-making collapses. The gun's effectiveness lay not only in raw penetration, but in consistency. It could deliver destructive force reliably, repeatedly, and under conditions where earlier weapons would fail. This reliability changed how crews fought. They could engage with confidence rather than desperation. They could choose positions, angles, and timing with a sense of control. The gun did not just destroy enemy tanks, it reshaped the mental landscape of combat. Confidence is contagious, and so is doubt. As Allied crews gained one, German crews increasingly felt the other. What made the situation even more dangerous for the Germans was that the tank itself did not announce this transformation. There was no dramatic visual cue signaling that the balance of power had shifted. From a distance, it looked like the same machine they had encountered before. That familiarity encouraged underestimation. German gunners might delay firing, maneuver less cautiously, or expose themselves longer than they should have. By the time they realized their error, the engagement was already lost. The gun had spoken, and its message was final. This highlights a deeper lesson about technological change in warfare. The most important innovations often exploit existing assumptions. Rather than introducing something entirely alien, they quietly alter a familiar system in a way that makes old knowledge dangerous. The gun did exactly that. It turned recognition into a trap. German crews recognized the tank, but they did not recognize what it had become. Their training, once a strength, became a vulnerability. The gun also represented industrial and strategic maturity. It reflected lessons learned the hard way through losses, failures, and adaptation. Allied forces had studied German armor carefully, analyzing thickness, slope, metallurgy, and combat reports. The gun was designed as an answer to these realities, not as a theoretical improvement, but as a practical solution. It did not need to be revolutionary in every aspect. It needed to work, and it needed to work now. In war, effectiveness beats elegance every time. Moreover, the gun shifted the tempo of armored combat. Engagements that once favored German tanks at long range now became dangerous much sooner. The Panther's advantage in range and penetration was no longer uncontested. This forced German crews to close distance, reposition more frequently, or avoid engagements altogether. Each of these options carried risks. The battlefield became less predictable for them, and unpredictability is the enemy of confidence. The importance of the gun also underscores a truth about systems. Upgrading one critical component can redefine the whole. The tank's armor, engine, and suspension remained largely within familiar parameters, but the new gun elevated the entire platform. It transformed an adequate vehicle into a lethal one. This approach had practical benefits as well. It allowed rapid deployment, easier training, and logistical continuity. Crews did not need to relearn everything. They needed to understand that their primary weapon had changed the rules. For German forces, this was a bitter realization. They had invested heavily in the idea that technical superiority in armor design would secure dominance. The Panther was the product of that belief. But the battlefield does not reward pride. It rewards adaptability. When faced with a gun that could defeat their best tank, the myth of invincibility shattered. Armor that once inspired confidence now felt thin. Engagement doctrines that once worked now seemed inadequate. The gun forced a re-evaluation that came too late. There is also a symbolic dimension to this story. The tank represented power, industrial strength, and national pride. To see it destroyed by something that looked ordinary was deeply unsettling. It suggested that superiority was not guaranteed, that the enemy had learned, adapted, and closed the gap. The gun became a symbol of that learning. It was proof that experience, analysis, and persistence could overcome early disadvantages. In the end, the secret was never about surprise in the theatrical sense. It was about transformation without spectacle. The gun did not need to look different, it needed to perform differently, and it did. It redefined what was possible in armored combat and exposed the danger of relying too heavily on past success. The Germans could recognize the tank, but recognition did not save them. Understanding would have, but understanding lagged behind reality. This story reminds us that in war, as in life, the most decisive changes often occur beneath the surface. We focus on appearances, labels, reputations, but outcomes are shaped by underlying capabilities. The gun was the quiet answer to a loud problem. It did not announce itself with mystery, it announced itself with impact. One shot at a time, it rewrote the rules of engagement and demonstrated that true power lies not in what we think we see, but in what actually works when everything is on the line. So when we speak of secrets, we should be careful. The real secret is rarely hidden behind dramatic camouflage or exotic design. More often, it is found in the disciplined improvement of a single, crucial element. In this case, it was the gun, the focused, deliberate enhancement of destructive capability that turned a familiar tank into a decisive weapon. And by the time the enemy realized that truth, the lesson had already been delivered in steel and fire. Arrogance in war is rarely loud at first. It often begins quietly, disguised as confidence earned from past victories, reinforced by familiar successes, and protected by assumptions that no longer deserve protection. The moment when a supposedly inferior enemy weapon destroys what was believed to be the best machine on the battlefield does more than shatter steel. It fractures certainty. That fracture is dangerous because it exposes how arrogance dulls perception, narrows imagination, and invites catastrophe long before the first shot is fired. The danger of arrogance lies in its ability to turn experience into blindness. Armies that win early tend to believe they have solved war itself. Their doctrines harden, their expectations stabilize, and their enemies are unconsciously frozen in time. When a force assumes it understands the battlefield better than its opponent, it stops truly observing it. This is not a failure of intelligence or technology. It is a failure of humility. Arrogance convinces commanders that yesterday's truths will automatically govern tomorrow's fights, even when the environment, the enemy, and the technology have changed. In war, familiarity is a powerful anesthetic. When soldiers encounter machines, tactics, or behaviors they believe they already understand, they relax their mental guard. Familiar shapes lead to familiar conclusions. A tank silhouette recognized from previous campaigns is mentally categorized before it is fully evaluated. This mental shortcut saves time, but it also opens the door to fatal misjudgment. Arrogance amplifies this effect by encouraging overconfidence in those shortcuts. Instead of questioning whether something familiar might be used in a new way, arrogance insists that what has been seen before cannot truly surprise. This is how arrogance transforms advantage into vulnerability. A superior machine, praised in reports and admired in training, becomes a symbol of invincibility rather than a tool with limits. Once that symbol is internalized, any challenge to it is dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. When the impossible finally happens, when the best tank is destroyed by something assumed to be lesser, the shock is profound. The loss is not merely tactical. It is psychological. The realization that assumptions were wrong arrives too late to prevent the consequences. Arrogance also thrives on comparison rather than evaluation. Instead of asking, "What can this enemy do now?" arrogant forces ask, "How does this enemy compare to what we have already defeated?" This framing is deeply flawed. War is not static. Every encounter is shaped by new conditions, new improvisations, and new priorities. When commanders compare instead of analyze, they risk preparing for an enemy that no longer exists. Arrogance encourages this error because it is comforting. It reassures leaders that they are still ahead, still smarter, still untouchable. One of the most dangerous aspects of arrogance in war is its resistance to feedback. Evidence that contradicts established beliefs is often dismissed, delayed, or explained away. Early warnings are labeled anomalies. Reports from the front are softened to fit expectations. Soldiers who experience something unexpected may hesitate to speak up, fearing disbelief or punishment. Arrogance creates an environment where bad news travels slowly, if at all. By the time reality forces itself into recognition, the cost has multiplied. This resistance to feedback is especially deadly in technological warfare. Machines evolve faster than doctrine, and doctrine evolves faster than mindset. When a force becomes emotionally attached to a particular weapon or system, it begins to defend that attachment rather than test it. Engineers are pressured to confirm success instead of explore weakness. Training emphasizes strengths while neglecting vulnerabilities. Arrogance ensures that blind spots remain unexamined until the enemy finds them first. Arrogance also distorts risk assessment. Confident forces take risks believing their superiority will compensate for uncertainty. They advance faster than their intelligence, commit assets without sufficient reconnaissance, and assume that even if something goes wrong, their strength will overwhelm the problem. Sometimes this works, until it doesn't. When a risk meets an enemy innovation, the result can be sudden and irreversible. What was once boldness becomes recklessness, and recklessness in war is rarely forgiven. Another danger lies in how arrogance affects adaptation. Successful armies must adapt constantly, not only to defeat but also to victory. Victory teaches lessons, but arrogance freezes them. Instead of asking how an enemy might respond, arrogant forces assume the enemy cannot respond effectively at all. This leads to stagnation. Meanwhile, the defeated side, driven by necessity rather than pride, experiments relentlessly. Innovation often comes not from confidence, but from desperation. Arrogance blinds the victor to this dynamic. The psychological impact of arrogance extends beyond commanders to individual soldiers. When troops believe their equipment or doctrine makes them inherently superior, they may underestimate the enemy's skill, courage, or creativity. This can lead to careless exposure, poor coordination, and delayed reactions. When reality intrudes, when an enemy demonstrates unexpected effectiveness, the shock can erode morale rapidly. Confidence collapses faster than it was built, because it was never grounded in continuous evaluation. Arrogance also reshapes the narrative a military tells itself. Stories of invincibility circulate, reinforcing belief rather than scrutiny. Failures are reframed as exceptions rather than warnings. Over time, this narrative becomes self-protecting. It resists change because change would imply that the narrative was flawed. War, however, punishes narratives that refuse to evolve. It does not care how impressive a reputation is. It only responds to what works in the moment. One of the most revealing aspects of arrogance in war is how it underestimates the enemy's learning curve. Even technologically inferior forces can observe, analyze, and adapt. They can study weaknesses, exploit habits, and design solutions that do not require matching strength directly. Arrogance assumes that learning is one-sided, that only the superior force improves. In reality, the pressure of inferiority often accelerates learning. The enemy experiments precisely because they must. This creates a paradox. The more dominant a force becomes, the greater the risk that arrogance will hollow out that dominance from within. Success reduces urgency. Reduced urgency slows innovation. Slower innovation widens the gap between perception and reality. When that gap is finally revealed, it often happens violently in a single encounter that exposes months or years of complacency. Arrogance in war also manifests as a belief in inevitability. When leaders convince themselves that victory is certain, they begin to treat warning signs as irrelevant. Why worry about small losses if the overall outcome is guaranteed? Why invest in uncomfortable changes if the current path seems sufficient? This belief in inevitability erodes discipline and focus. It turns war from a contest into a procession, until the procession is ambushed by reality. The danger becomes most apparent when arrogance meets innovation. Innovation does not need to be revolutionary to be decisive. It only needs to exploit an assumption. A slight improvement in firepower, coordination, or timing can overturn a larger, more impressive system if that system was designed around outdated beliefs. Arrogance ensures those beliefs go unchallenged. It locks design and doctrine into a past moment that no longer exists. There is also a moral dimension to arrogance in war. When a force believes itself superior, it may dehumanize the enemy, dismissing their competence and resilience. This dehumanization reduces empathy, which in turn reduces understanding. Understanding an enemy requires imagining their perspective, their fears, and their incentives. Arrogance replaces this curiosity with contempt. Contempt is a poor foundation for strategy. Arrogance can even distort logistics and planning. Confident forces may underestimate the need for redundancy, assuming systems will work as intended. They may stretch supply lines, overextend units, or ignore maintenance issues. When something fails, and something always does in war, the lack of preparation magnifies the damage. Arrogance treats failure as unlikely. War treats failure as inevitable. The moment when arrogance is exposed is often sudden and humiliating. A single engagement reveals that the enemy is not only capable, but prepared. What was thought impossible becomes undeniable. In that moment, excuses rush in. Bad luck, isolated circumstances, unfair conditions. But beneath those excuses lies a simpler truth, the failure to question assumptions before the enemy did it for you. What makes arrogance especially dangerous is that it feels justified until it collapses. Confidence based on success is not inherently wrong. It becomes arrogance when it stops listening, stops testing, and stops doubting itself. War rewards those who balance confidence with skepticism, pride with curiosity, and strength with humility. When that balance is lost, even the strongest force becomes fragile. The exposure of arrogance is not merely a lesson for the defeated side, it is a warning to all who observe it. Every military, every commander, and every system carries the seeds of overconfidence. The lesson is not that superiority is meaningless, but that it must be continually re-earned. Each engagement resets the equation. Past victories grant no immunity. In the end, Arrogance in war is dangerous because it replaces reality with belief. It encourages forces to fight the war they expect instead of the war that exists. When belief finally collides with reality, steel breaks, plans collapse, and lives are lost. The true cost of arrogance is not embarrassment or pride. It is preventable failure. The moment that exposes arrogance is rarely dramatic in intention, but it becomes dramatic in consequence. It reminds us that war is not impressed by reputation, and it does not forgive complacency. The battlefield is an unforgiving examiner. It tests not only machines and tactics, but the mindset behind them. And when that mindset is arrogant, the verdict is often swift, brutal, and final. In the end, that single moment on the battlefield lingers not because of the metal that burned or the crew that fled, but because of the lesson it carved into history. The Germans did not lose faith in a machine that day. They lost faith in an assumption. They had believed that superiority, once achieved, could be assumed forever, that past success guaranteed future dominance. When that belief shattered, it revealed how fragile power becomes when it hardens into certainty. War has a way of punishing those who confuse reputation with reality, and the smoking remains of the Panther were a reminder that confidence, when it slips into arrogance, blinds even the most skilled and disciplined forces. That encounter teaches us that innovation does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as something ordinary, waiting for the right moment to speak with devastating clarity. The danger lies not in being outmatched, but in believing you cannot be. When an army stops questioning its own assumptions, it stops adapting, and when it stops adapting, it begins to lose often before it realizes the fight has changed. The true enemy, then, is not the tank across the field, but the complacency within one's own ranks. History remembers victors and vanquished, but it also remembers warnings. This moment stands as one of them, a caution against hubris, against mistaking past triumphs for permanent truth. Technology evolves, enemies learn, and the battlefield never remains static. Those who survive are not always the strongest or the most feared, but those who remain humble enough to prepare for the unexpected. And that, more than firepower or armor, is the enduring lesson left behind when arrogance meets reality and loses.